Every gamer has those few video game moments that stick with them forever. And for me, one of my most formative experiences with a game goes back to the PlayStation 2 and this bucket. This unassuming vessel of ice is from Metal Gear Solid 2, and it alone changed the way I interact with my video games. Because of this bucket, I was inspired to start taking the time to really look at the games I play. To most, or who am I kidding, maybe all of you watching, that statement probably needs a lot more explanation, which is perfect, because I've got a lot more to say about it. Like I mentioned, this all started with MGS2. It was released on the PS2 in 2001 and later on many other platforms. For folks that have never played it before, it's a stealth-based action game. At the very start, you play as infiltration specialist Solid Snake. You're given a wide array of tools and skills to accomplish sneakery-centered tasks without calling too much attention to Snake. A goal that I admittedly fail at every so often. At the beginning of the game, you covertly board a large cargo freighter during a storm. Once inside the ship, you can find this kind of lounge area. The first time playing, when I found this, I immediately began to explore more of the space. I was poking around and doing my very best not to be discovered by enemy soldiers guarding the zone. While using Snake's tranquilizer pistol, I saw a guard and tried to silently subdue him. Missing my shot, I accidentally hit a glass partition behind him. A couple of times. No, I'm not the best shot, but that's not important right now. This is what's important. The glass shattered. It was a big moment. Remember, this is over 20 years ago, and many of the games I had played up until that point didn't have shattering glass. And even if they did, they definitely didn't have tumbling shards that looked that realistic. So I thought to myself, hey, what else can I shoot? Being a man of science and experimentation, I shot at televisions, magazines, potted plants, but only one thing really stopped me dead in my tracks when I took aim and pulled back that trigger. This silver bucket of ice. When I shot it, something wild happened. The bucket fell over, sending each individual ice cube tumbling out of it as well. This moment was revolutionary for me at the time. Most items in 3D worlds were usually static, solitary objects that, if interactable at all, didn't feature this much detail. I couldn't help but stare at this thing and wonder. And while I did, something else began to transpire. The ice began to vanish. It was melting away. Melting in front of my eyes. I mean, folks, I know ice melts. I have lived, but I mean, in a video game? I'd never seen that before. Now, if you're impatient, you don't need to wait for all that hard water to vanish. You can take aim at every individual ice cube, shoot, and obliterate each and every one. This intense amount of interactivity with a blink and you miss it object in Metal Gear Solid 2 was beyond impressive. This insignificant background element, set dressing for the lounge's bar, something completely detached from any objective in the game, had so much thought put into it. The designers cared that much about their world feeling immersive. They were inviting the player to test the limits of possibilities in a virtual space. Something like this ice bucket can totally change the way someone interacts with a video game. I don't know if you can tell, but yeah, it certainly left its mark on me. Has me thinking about a mundane-looking bucket of ice several decades later. I even bought my own ice bucket figurine.
Shine in a little bucket.
It's a real bucket, it's not Photoshop.
Anyway, from that day forward, with every game I play, I try to find out if it also has ice bucket. Yeah, that's what I call it now. If a video game has an interactive element, item, or feature that in no way benefits the player's in-game goals, but builds a more immersive or entertaining world, it's got Ice Bucket. Don't get me wrong, I've also played and enjoyed many video games without Ice Bucket. It's not like I throw a title to the curb when it's lacking the element. When I finds it, it's a thrill every time. But let's together dive into this thing a little more. I want to show you a bunch of my personal favorite ice bucket moments in games, and hopefully, by the end of this video, you'll recognize unessential flourishes that add a little something extra to the games you spend your time with too. First up, let's go back to the game that started it all, Metal Gear Solid 2. In the very same bar where the whole ice bucket adventure started, you'll see a bunch of bottles and glasses. You can fire at those bottles, individually shattering them with a bit of liquid staining the bottom of the shelf. Metal Gear Solid 2 is covered in details like this throughout the entire game. Things like looking in first-person mode on the deck during a storm and seeing little droplets hit your vision, busting locker doors off their hinges by punching and kicking them, rustling up plants and having leaves fall to the ground, looking up at the sky to see a bird majestically soaring through the air and having its poop fly into your face. The game is just jam-packed with wonderful stuff. Look, more bird gravy on the ground. Yup, you can slip on bird poop. Hey, ice bucket is ice bucket. Nowadays, you might get an achievement for these kind of things, which is a way for the game designers to highlight what they've created to enhance the environment that a gamer plays in. But when Metal Gear Solid 2 came out, there were no achievements on PlayStation 2. All of this was added in, essentially, for fun. It doesn't amount to much beyond deepening the interaction between the game and the player, even slipping on bird poop. Here's Duke Nukem 3D, a first-person shooter that hit PC back in 1996. Early into the game, you'll find a room with a pool table, and if you go up to that table, you can hit each ball individually until they're all sunk into the pockets of the table itself. This was not at all needed. It didn't even do anything to affect the broader game. There was no added score or anything like that. I remember very specifically that all my friends spoke fondly about this one element of Duke Nukem 3D. Some of us even loaded up this level to actually try and play a real billiards game. It was crazy. This inconsequential playable pool table, it allowed me and my friends to create a self-imposed multiplayer experience separate from the actual single-player gameplay. We weren't shooting aliens and listening to Duke's endless one-liner solo, we were playing pool together. That's the power of Ice Bucket right there. By the way, ice buckets aren't solely found in 3D worlds. 2D games can have them too. Take Hideo Kojima's Blade Runner-inspired classic, Snatcher. Yup, the creator of Metal Gear Solid started weaving deep details and interactive world building into his titles way before his polygonal releases. This is the Sega CD version of Snatcher, released to North America in 1994. You play as Gillian Seed, who's working for an agency that hunts down biomechanical androids called Snatchers. The game takes place in the far distant future of 2047 in fictional Neo-Kobe, Japan. At Snatcher headquarters, you can use a computer called Jordan, which is used at certain points in the game for information and data gathering. It has a library of information for a bunch of characters you'll see in the game world that can help benefit your investigation. And if you only use it for those intended purposes, you probably really wouldn't consider it a special part of the game. Heck, my first time playing? I know I didn't. But on later playthroughs, I started to really explore it a bit more, and I discovered that this computer Jordan featured a detailed glossary and encyclopedia of this future world. Look at all this. Someone had to write entry after entry of lore in hopes that the player might be interested in reading more about this sci-fi future setting. You don't need any of this to complete the game. Yet, here it is, detailing historical events, political issues, geography, sports, and art. Check out this article on the Purse Pet.
Genetically engineered marsupials, which function as pets or handbags. Their added value of being able to carry around personal belongings led to a huge boom in these animals in the early 2040s. But their popularity waned when the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals complained of their slave-like treatment. Many owners gave their living luggage.
This information never at any point comes up at all during the main game. A living purse possum? Seriously? Kojima and his team would also utilize the same approach later in a game called Police Knots that featured its own pretty detailed glossary of items and terms. So this is very much a standard practice they employed, but no less impressive. Now folks, I remember when the Dreamcast originally came out. Heck, I bought one. And let me tell you, Shenmue was probably one of the biggest reasons to own that console. It's a game that feels open and explorable in a way that other games in the year 2000 really weren't doing. And with that comes a whole lot of Ice Bucket. There are a bunch of inconsequential interactive elements scattered around the world of Shenmue, but there's one that's always felt strangely impressive to me that I want to highlight. You can go into a bunch of stores, look around, and buy random items that will not further the game's story at all. And one specific collection of items is dominant. These gachapon capsule toys. You can collect them all over in various ways. Each one is a fully designed 3D model that you can inspect in your inventory. Many of them are inspired by classic Sega properties, others just random things like you'd find in a real capsule toy machine. No, these colored balls, dice, and impromptu Sega history knickknacks didn't need to be in the game. But popping open something new never fails to satisfy, and heck, seeing some of these Sega characters just makes me want to dive back into those games as well. Valve's groundbreaking first-person shooter Half-Life isn't short on impressive moments you'll experience while you play. The moment you, as Gordon Freeman, walk into the Black Mesa research facility, you'll see a bunch of characters walking around going about their business, and it doesn't take long to find some ice bucket.
My God, what are you doing?
Come on, Gordon. You trying to get me into trouble?
Here's a break room that has no reason to exist besides world building. Absolutely zero reason for you to go in. It's easy to miss, but duck in and check it out and you'll discover some fun details inside. There are vending machines that have actual workable buttons. Once clicked, the machine releases a canned beverage. You can also use a microwave. If you keep clicking the microwave power and turn it up far too high, you'll blow up somebody's food that they left inside.
My God, what are you doing?
When you find something like this right at the beginning of a game, it's a good sign that there's plenty of rich detail to discover later on. Speaking of rich detail incorporated into games, let's talk about Hitman. I feel like the original Hitman, Codename 47, has been greatly overlooked as the series has evolved. The latest entries and their subsequent collection are not only the best Hitman games in existence, but also some of my all-time favorite titles. But that doesn't mean the first Hitman game should be forgotten. Yes, it's older, a little rougher around the edges, and a lot more difficult to play, but the designers went to great lengths for the time to give the world an extra touch of detail. Throughout the game, you'll find interactive objects that were some of the very first implementations of real-time cloth physics I had ever seen. You can walk up to one of these banners and see the fabric move freely as Agent 47 walks around and through it. Most of the game world feels largely static, with minor things moving around, like some non-playable characters and maybe a vehicle here or there. So to see this slowly and properly moving in the wind really heightens the sense of life in this world, especially when you're sitting on a nearby rooftop searching for a target through a sniper scope. Further into the game, you get to a jungle level, and that implementation of real-time physics was seemingly also used to greater and more obvious effect with the foliage you walk by. Look at these plants move out of the way of Agent 47. It's impressive. Games of this era usually had character models clip through this kind of stuff. You also see vines hanging from trees that move out of the way just like the banners from the other stage. There are even smaller plants that are realistically shifted and pushed around as Agent 47 walks through them. These are easy to miss details, with lots of care placed into them, but like many of the ice buckets we've already seen, they add a thoughtful and creative sense of realism to the world. Get out your night vision goggles, it's time to look at Tom Clancy's Splinter Cell from 2002. This game had an ice bucket I didn't even know about until I played it for this video. Early in the game, protagonist Sam Fisher finds himself in an apartment. Here, you'll see stacks of documents and papers all over the place. When I first played this game, I did everything I could to conserve ammo and be an efficient sneakster. But while replaying the game for research, I decided to shoot these stacks of paper. When you do that, a blast of paper confetti flies into the air. We've all seen destroyable objects implemented before, but what makes this interaction truly ice bucket, well look, the stack proceeds to get shorter and shorter if you continue to pepper it with bullets. I promise you, this serves no purpose in the game, and I'm pretty sure a lot of people missed it. But personally, I think it's really neat. But King Ice Bucket in this game, the one that stands out the most, has got to be this fish tank. Shoot the tank once, a hole appears that actually drains out the water. But here's the kicker. It stops draining when it gets to the level of the bullet hole. You can shoot it again and it will shatter, spilling water on the floor and ejecting a couple of fish out to their doom. Sorry, fishies. Just like in Hitman Codename 47, they also have cloth physics here as well. I love seeing this stuff. especially in older games. There's something about having cloth physics in a space that, when I see it, I immediately feel like these details were important to the artists. It always seems to make a still room come alive. Maybe there's an open window with some wind or a vent blowing out some recirculated air. It's just something I've always appreciated. In 2000's Deus Ex for PC, most gamers focus on the incredible narrative and gameplay choices this legendary title gives you. And with all that narrative flair and decision-making, it might be easy to miss some ice bucket just waiting for you in the game's many streets and alleyways. Often when you're walking around, you'll see garbage bags. If you break them open, a bunch of garbage will fall out of them. That alone, a minor detail. Little scraps of refuse spread around. But sometimes, a live rat will come scurrying out, and that rat won't disappear. It'll move around the environment. These rats become full-fledged parts of the world. Fun fact, when I was trying to capture this footage to show this off, I accidentally stepped on a rat and killed it. So hey, look at that. Ice buckets can lead to feelings of guilt too. In Nintendo and Retro Studios' first Metroid Prime release, as soon as Samus steps off her spaceship, look up. You can immediately see asteroids floating by freely in space. You may have played this game 1,000 times and seen these exact same floating rocks, not paying them much mind. But simply aim your blaster and fire at a couple, and you'll notice that these rocks break apart realistically. And the rocks that break apart from those rocks can also be fired on and destroyed. This has no function and serves absolutely no purpose to the story or gameplay. It's just cool. And in a game like Metroid that is all about exploration and trial and error in an impressively designed and extremely detailed world, these little hallmarks early on make you realize that you should be paying close attention to everything you see, because you never know what you're gonna find. This next one's for you gardeners out there. Far Cry 2, released in 2008. It's got an open world design where you can drive and go virtually anywhere you want. While many focused on the gunplay and traversal mechanics, I was hooked on one specific thing: foliage. Yeah, folks, back to my Hitman roots. Did you get the pun? Good. I know. It seems kind of crazy that anyone would actually be looking at foliage in a game that has so many other things going on. But this vegetation really does stick out. When I first played the game, I noticed that we had access to a flamethrower. And with that flamethrower, we could light an entire patch of grass and brush on fire. The fire can propagate and burn everything in its wake. This can be used as a defensive tactic to harm oncoming enemies, so that makes it useful. Definitely not Ice Bucket. But because of all that burning shrubbery, I started to look closer at the trees and plants. Alright, let's take a look at this tree. It's got a bunch of branches, it's got a bunch of leaves. I'm gonna take out my weapon and fire a few times. Well, would you look at that? As you can see, the branch falls off. You can go around the tree shooting every individual branch until it's lost all of its extremities. And why stop there? We can also shoot the stubs beneath the places we just shot to further remove even more matter from the vegetation. Honestly, the detail on display here is more complicated than what we get in many modern games. This was probably only noticeable to people that would go into large firefights and explore the backgrounds afterwards to see all the damage they created. They didn't have to make the trees destructible like this, but they did. Very clever work from the Ubisoft folks. For fun, let's take a trip into virtual reality. Half-Life Alyx, again by the folks at Valve. By its core design principles as a virtual reality title, this game has to be interactive in a specific way in order for it to feel engaging in a virtual space. So in my mind, just being able to interact with an object doesn't count as Ice Bucket here, but these bottles sure feel like Ice Bucket to me. You can find bottles with varying liquids that realistically slosh and move around as you shift the beverages all over. This impressive visual with realistic looking liquid isn't common. I'm always taken aback when I see so much attention paid to details that are probably an afterthought to someone actually playing through the game. It's absolutely unimportant to your in-game goals, much like the markers you get to play with right at the start of this game. Actual working markers. You could just spend hours doodling away as you overlook this captivating cityscape. What are we supposed to be doing right now? Saving the world? Maybe later. I'm too busy drawing dinosaurs. You know, this wasn't even the only time I've seen markers integrated like this. Duke Nukem Forever did it as well right at the start of the game. Now, I'm not saying this game is all that great. Some might say it's just bad. But for a few brief moments at the start, it felt like a lot was being done to build immersion. We've gone on a journey together through a bunch of Ice Bucket examples, so by now we probably all know what Ice Bucket is. But not everything that's interactive or detail-oriented is necessarily Ice Bucket. Some folks might consider Ice Bucket just another term for Easter egg, but these are not the same thing. The primary difference? Easter eggs are not defined by their interactivity. It could be as simple as a poster on a wall. More often than not, they're usually references to external, unrelated topics, or they're jokes or gags, maybe even oddities. In Fallout New Vegas, if you play the game with a Wild Wasteland trait, you can find the skeleton of a familiar archaeologist adventurer, a reference to an infamous scene from Indiana Jones and the Crystal Skull. This is an Easter egg, it's not an ice bucket. If you stumble on something that when you look at it you go, oh, check out that reference they put into the game, it's probably an Easter egg, as opposed to the good old ice bucket. No one was walking by that and going, oh cool, I know that bucket! Ice buckets are always interactive and can be completely missed. They might even appear mundane, where Easter eggs, once found, usually stand out a lot more. If you want to find Ice Bucket but don't have the time to spend interacting with every element of a game to see what happens, I've got a tip for you. The quickest route to Ice Bucket I've ever found in games has been in the bathroom. Now, it probably sounds stupid, but trust me on this, folks. A bathroom is usually the greatest indicator of Ice Bucket in a video game. Digital artists that create a virtualized bathroom will feature any number of elements. A toilet, a sink, a shower, you name it. These items here are what happens when you turn a non-interactive element into passive interactive flair. Walk up to a toilet, try to flush it. Can you actually see the water inside the porcelain bowl fall and rise just like in the real world? When you see a sink, can you turn it on? Can you see the water escaping the tap? When you see a shower, can you turn that on? Does a mist of aquatic refreshness escape the shower head? Usable toilets, sinks, and showers transform a completely useless room into a more realistic impression of a livable space. By adding interaction with these typical fixtures, they become a memorable element. So if you're like me, you'll always try flushing every toilet you find. If a game doesn't feature bathrooms, think about common objects and items in the world and how they would be interactive in real life. Do you see a flat, still surface of water? Does it splash and ripple when you throw something into it? See a radio? Does it turn on and play music? See a TV? Can you turn it on and watch something on it? All of these little details are Ice Bucket, and they might give you a hint to look for more interesting things that developers have included in their worlds. Let's circle on back to where we started this whole adventure. Look, by this point, I gotta imagine you all get that I'm a pretty big fan of Metal Gear Solid 2. I've talked a lot about the small details in that game, but know what I'm an even bigger fan of? Metal Gear Solid 3. That game? I love that game. I don't want to call it perfect, but I hold it in high regard. And because it rewinds the narrative of the series beyond anything the previous Metal Gear games had dealt with, I'd argue that you can pick up MGS3 not knowing anything about the series and have a crazy good time with it. Metal Gear Solid 3 features detailed and immersive locations with a bunch of fun environments to explore. And let me tell you, there is a great amount of minutia in how you can accomplish goals in Metal Gear Solid 3. Take the game's beginning and this rope bridge. While an enemy soldier is crossing the bridge, you can shoot out pieces of the rope holding it up. This makes the bridge unstable and potentially causes a soldier to take a dive. There are other inventive ways to use your environment in this game too, like making use of a hornet's nest in a tree. If you fire at it, it'll come crashing down, angering the insects. If a soldier happens to be nearby, the hornets will naturally head over and welcome their suspected enemy to Stingtown. Since these can impact your gameplay and be used as defenses or traps, They're definitely not Ice Bucket, but you can still see that very same creative spirit and interactivity in their designs. I personally believe that if Metal Gear Solid 2 didn't feature so many non-essential interactive elements, stuff like this would have never happened in its sequel. Oh, but don't get me wrong, there are still Ice Bucket interactions in Metal Gear Solid 3. The title screen for the game, fully interactive. You can change colors, change textures, invert the animation, slow the animation down, speed the animation up, and shift the location and colors of textures with your thumbsticks. MGS2 featured something similar to this, but it's way more interactive here in MGS3. It's completely unneeded, yet it makes the uninteresting everyday title card for a video game become way more engaging. The same interactive principles also exist for the game's musical intro credits. Tons of interactive bits and pieces all over, helping keep what would otherwise be a passive video you watch play out become something you can actually play around with. To this day, across many games that I've played, it's an element we rarely see in other games. Honestly, the entirety of the Metal Gear franchise has plenty of remarkable, clever designs cooked into the games. Lots of Ice Buckets to be had, and I'd encourage you to seek them out because there are lots of mind-blowing, inessential gameplay moments to be discovered. This entire Ice Bucket label of mine started with Metal Gear Solid 2, and I would argue that one of the reasons that game featured something like an Ice Bucket at all was because of the game's creative director, Hideo Kojima. Now obviously, it wasn't just Kojima working on the project. He had a whole team of equally creative people working alongside him, and together they made these things possible, which is why I'm incredibly nervous about Konami. Yeah, folks, we're about to talk shop. Buckle up. For those of you that don't know, Konami was the development home for Hideo Kojima. In 2015, Kojima parted ways with Konami in a famously messy and controversial split, leaving Konami with the Metal Gear Solid IP. And now, Konami is bringing back Metal Gear Solid 3 in an all-new remake called Metal Gear Solid Delta: Snake Eater. From what I've gathered from the developers that have been talking about the game, they've been discussing matching the energy, gameplay, and styling of the original title itself that came out all the way back on the PlayStation 2. Now, a lot of people have been very excited about this game, especially Metal Gear fans, and I get it. I've got to be honest, I've been looking forward to this as well. But Konami's history with creatives has got me a bit on edge. I've read numerous reports of employees that were mistreated, and I have a personal belief that Ice Bucket only comes from game developers who are given the freedom and support to add those details into a world when they have the time, resources, and creative drive. I know many people are excited about the enhanced visuals we've been seeing from the trailers and many other elements that have been hinted at, but the ideas that made the game so impressive wasn't just its story and gameplay. A lot of it was all the wonderful hidden details spread across the entire game. And that right there is where I have my doubts that Konami will be able to create that stuff from scratch. That was the magic Kojima and his team sprinkled like fairy dust into their masterworks. Konami is just a company, a logo, nothing more. People are what make the games, and the people who made Metal Gear what it was, many of them are no longer with that developer. Remember folks, it's a remake. Yes, they're using the same motion capture elements to recreate the cutscenes. Yes, they're also using the original vocal performances. Yes, they have stated that they're trying to replicate the gameplay as close as possible to the original, but it's not as simple as a copy and paste job. There are tiny nuanced elements all over this game that would be very easy to get lost in translation. It's not even just about redoing the Ice Bucket stuff that was there in the original game, like the interactive background elements of the title card. We already got that in 2004. I'd argue they need to put in everything that was there before and then add more. To truly make Metal Gear Solid Delta matter, they need to go beyond what the original game did and showcase that they understand what Ice Bucket means. They're now the creators of the series. They're its stewards. You can't just mimic another creative's work. They need to bring their own vision. To be fair, I don't know these developers. Some of them may have been with Konami a long time, maybe even worked on these games originally. They've likely got things cooking that they haven't shown off yet, but nothing I've seen shows me that this game is going to be any better than the original release. Sure, it looks shiny and new, and maybe has a couple of new modernized controls going on in it, but they've not shown us what I believe matters. If you're gonna take all this time, energy, and money to bring Metal Gear Solid back from the grave, you should at least be trying to further the vision of the original game, beyond higher resolution, sharper textures, and maybe faster loading times. If Konami and their development partners aren't careful, they could parade out a soulless doppelganger of Metal Gear Solid 3. Something that looks the part but misses what made that game, and others like it, so special to experience. When I sit down to boot up Delta, I want to feel like the designers are talking to me and inviting me to explore their world. And if I don't feel that, it's going to be a huge letdown. The list of games I've talked to you about today is just a minor selection of what you can find out there that contains Ice Bucket. And if there is any game that you know about that has it, and you don't think anyone's ever talked about it, share it with everyone in the comments below. I want to see us make a list of these games to excite people to go back and explore games from the past that they missed for one reason or another. Because if I'm right, I don't think any game that truly has Ice Bucket was ever a waste of time.